So what's up guys, it's your boy OT and welcome to Steady Bro. In this video, we'll be looking at arrhythmias. So what is an arrhythmia? An arrhythmia is from the Greek word rhythmus, not rhythmus, from your throat, rhythmus, plus the prefix a, meaning without, so arrhythmus, meaning without rhythm. So in the context of the heart, an arrhythmia is when the heart deviates from its normal rhythm. Bro, clap for me. So good, isn't it? In this video, we will consider two types of arrhythmias. We will look at atrial fibrillation and atrial flutters. So what is an atrial fibrillation? An atrial fibrillation is when the orderly and proper depolarization of the atria is substituted by a chaotic, disorganized electrical impulse in the atria. Let's look at it like this. The normal heart is like a dictatorship led by the sinoatrial node. It sets the pace as the natural pacemaker of the heart, and everything else follows suit. In atrial fibrillation, however, this looks more like a democracy, with everybody shouting at the same time just because they can, resulting in a barrage of ideas seeking expression without achieving anything. The occasional ideas are heard, but you wouldn't bet your money on it because they are not regular. In the context of the heart, everybody shouting is electrical impulses from the other algorithmic cells within the atria. Let's have a closer look inside the heart. In a normal heart, the electrical impulse begins in the sinoatrial node. It depolarizes the atria, goes through the AV, and then moves on to depolarize the ventricles. In atrial fibrillation, however, there are multiple foci from which these impulses arise. Therefore, there is no coordination, resulting in a haphazard contraction of the atria. Because this is not organized, the AV node only allows some of these impulses to go through it. So when this occurs, then you are able to see a QRS complex on the ECG graph. Now, because of this haphazard discharge of electrical impulses, there is noise on the baseline. You cannot really distinguish any P wave because the foci are multiple. Multiple cells out here dancing, no organization. The QRS complexes are not regular because the AV node is not allowing the impulse of every foci to reach the ventricles. Else this would be a madness. To sum it up, in an atrial fibrillation, there are no P waves, the QRS is irregular, and the QRS complex is narrow, highlighting the fact that the source of this arrhythmia is from the atria and not the ventricle. This is important, and we'll look at it in subsequent videos when we consider ventricular tachycardia, ventricular fibrillation, and so forth. Now, let's look at an atrial flutter. As the name does suggest, atrial flutters originate from the atria, like an atrial fibrillation. The question is, what is the difference? I think the major difference is the source from which the electrical impulses originate. As I said earlier, in an atrial fibrillation, there are multiple foci from which these impulses come from. In an atrial flutter, though the source is not the sinoatrial node, the focus is one, right? It's coming from the same place. But it is very rapid and there are no breaks in between. Okay, this would result in a very fast heart rate if all these impulses were going through the AV node into the ventricles. However, because the AV node does its best, not every impulse makes it to the ventricles. You can look at an atrial flutter like Eminem's Rap God. A whole lot of words, but you might just catch a few. So that is what an atrial flutter is. It's a single focus, but the amount of discharge it's doing is beyond that which is normal for a normal heart. Hence, the AV node, the atrioventricular node, does not allow all these impulses to reach the ventricle. Else this would be a madness. You'll be walking out these streets looking like a broken washing machine. You don't want to be looking like that. If it allowed every impulse to go through, that would be crazy. You'll be talking about 300 beats per minute. And you don't want that kind of smoke in your heart. You definitely don't want that. No, but it's not good for you. You don't want that. So the AV salutes, you are doing a very nice job. Let's look at this in action. Once again, let's compare this to a normal heart. A normal heart discharge from the sinoatrial node depolarizes the atria, and this goes into the AV node, which then moves through the pandular phase to the left and right bundle branches through to the Purkinje fibers to depolarize the ventricles and cause a ventricular contraction. In an atrial flutter, however, because it has one focus of electrical impulse, you can see some broad waves. They are not your classical P waves. These are sawtooths. Because of the rapidity of the discharge, as one sawtooth ends, another one begins because there is no break in between them. Think of Eminem. You don't understand anything. That is how fast your heart is going. Not every sawtooth is followed by a QRS complex. This is due to the controlling activity of the atrioventricular node. But unlike atrial fibrillation, you don't see noise on the baseline because the focus is one and it's more organized than in multiple foci going off in an atrial fibrillation. So let's sum it up. So today we looked at atrial fibrillation and atrial flutter. In atrial fibrillation, there are multiple foci within the atria giving off electrical discharges. All right? And due to this alters the normal rhythm of the heart. Not all the impulses in an atrial fibrillation reach the ventricles. Therefore, the QRS complexes are irregular. And because there are multiple foci, you don't really see any P waves on the ECG graph. An atrial flutter, however, yes, it's an arrhythmia like AF, and yes, the site of discharge is different from the sinoatrial node. But in an atrial flutter, the focus is one, giving off discharge at a rapid rate. Hence, you see this sawtooth action on an ECG graph. Okay, the AV node controls how many impulses, how many electrical discharges are able to go through it to reach the ventricles and cause a depolarization. This can be a 3-to-1, a 4-to-1, whatever. But it is controlled by the AV node, and not every sawtooth action is followed by a QRS complex. Therefore, the ventricles are not depolarized by every single impulse that goes through the atria. That is the major difference between an atrial fibrillation and atrial flutter. So that'll be it from me today, guys. It's your bro OT. And if you have any suggestions, anything you think I can improve to make these videos clearer and better, let your boy know. Holla at me in the comments, and I'll take it from there. All right? So it's your boy OT. I'm out. Salutes.